right, welcome everybody to our webinar on advancing trustworthy innovation in healthcare using responsible AI. For those of you that have been to our Health Impact events before, you know we are a no BS event producer, and so we're going to have a really good time here talking to our Microsoft colleagues about how they're working on artificial intelligence, but in a way to make sure that it's responsible, fair, and trustworthy. Just a quick couple of logistics to get things out of the way. Of course, our audience is mostly muted, but we are going to take questions during our Q&A period live if you'd like to. But in the meantime, you've got the Q&A section, you've got the chat. Speak away. If the speakers are saying something and you find a good link somewhere, please share it with everyone. And if you've got some questions, keep dropping them in. If I find a very interesting question while the speakers are talking, I may just pull it up even before our Q&A section, but we will have a good one at the end. And of course, presentation is being recorded, and all of you will get it at the end. And then you're going to get an email with a link to the recording as well as a feedback. So hopefully, if you can give us some feedback, that'll be really good. With that, just love to get started here real quick. As we know, we all love to talk about the idea of patient-centered care, but in reality, we're mostly in institution-centered care. And those institutions that really talk about patient-centered have to know exactly how their patients want care to be delivered and deliver that care in the way that patients are expecting it, not in the way that our institutions, like our hospitals, our health systems, our payers and others set up their institutions. So we're very institution-centric today, but machine learning, artificial intelligence, these are techniques by which we can actually get a better understanding of patient care with respect to the health or the clinical part, but also with the finance, the experience in general for patients. So just as trust between a patient and a physician is important, so is the trustworthiness of almost anything that we use in AI. And we know that AI is going to be used to predict clinical outcomes. And in fact, that's obviously why we're building these things. But really the question is, if AI is predicting clinical outcomes or providing guidance to frontline workers, how do you trust that AI? How do you know that that AI is being fair and unbiased? How do you know, for example, that the input provided to it over the many weeks or months of training that has occurred is leading to the right answers? Now, the way that we do this, of course, in the real world with humans is we spend years training physicians. So they go through an enormous amount of training. They go through lots of evaluation. These trainees go through different specialties, et cetera. But are we doing that with AI? Are we doing that with machine learning? Training the machine, if it is going to do the kinds of things that our humans are going to do, should require at least as much training as we do for our humans, and maybe even more, because machines are not as cognitively intelligent as humans. So that's the core of this discussion. And as you all start to listen to what we're talking about here, drop in some comments, tell us where you think we're making leaps and bounds in ways that we should not be. Or if you agree with what we're saying, drop in some comments and let us know there. So we're going to start off. I'm going to have Tom introduce himself first. We're then going to go to Muhammed from Kensci, and then we're going to hand it off to Iksha, who will then introduce herself and really talk a little bit about how does Microsoft frame this idea of trustworthiness in AI. Just a few slides. As you all know, we like discussions more than slides, but I think this is a good technical topic to set a little bit up before we actually dive into the actual Q&A period. With that, Tom, please tell us your role and what you do at Microsoft and what makes AI so interesting in your career.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, and great to be with everyone today. So I'm Tom Lawry. I'm the National Director for Artificial Intelligence for Health and Life Sciences at Microsoft, which is a fancy title they gave me, where I have the privilege of working as a strategic advisor with providers, payers, and a little life science on projects involving use of artificial intelligence to basically transform the way healthcare works. And so what's not to get excited about all of that? I get to work with some of the smartest people in the world, using some of the best technology from Microsoft to try and make healthcare better. I mean, sometimes I can't believe they actually pay me. So that's who I am and what I do.
Fantastic. And of course, we're going to hear from a lot of the other writings and things that you've done in the field. So if anybody wants to read what Tom's been writing about, he'll tell us and drop some comments in the, drop some links into the chat to let us know where he can find all of his materials as well. Muhammed from Kensci, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're working on with your colleagues at Microsoft.
All right, excellent. Excellent. Again, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Muhammed Ahmed. I am a principal research scientist at Kensci, which is a Seattle-based startup focusing on AI in healthcare. And these days, my primary focus is actually on responsible AI. So looking at various aspects of explainable and how to make AI and machine learning models explainable, fair, and not just the models, but also in terms of delivery, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Yeah, what's great about what Muhammed is doing, especially at Kensci, is making it real, right? There's a lot of discussion. We all love having discussions about, yes, AI should be fair, yes, AI should be explainable, but there's got to be somebody actually working on it and making it happen. And that's why we're really excited to have Muhammed from Kensci here. Iksha, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then, and if you don't mind, Megan and team will go ahead and put up the slides while Iksha introduces herself. Then Iksha, please walk us through your thinking, and then we'll jump into the questions for you guys just after a few minutes when you present.
Sure. I'm Iksha Herr. I am Managing Director for Data and AI for the Health and Life Sciences Business Unit of Microsoft. I am newish to Microsoft, around 7 months. Prior to Microsoft, I have served in a variety of data science, and AI data management roles in pharma and life sciences. Right before I came to Microsoft, I was at AstraZeneca, and I was head of scientific data assets, data science and AI organization at AstraZeneca. I'm hearing an echo. Are you all hearing that as well? Just slightly, yes. Yeah. Maybe if others could go on mute while one speaker is on. So that's me. I am happy to jump into the slides. Emily, if you could set up the slides, please, I can start. The goal for these slides is to really set the context for what we're talking about. And it's not just responsible and fair AI, but really the practical aspects of how do you assess what is responsible and fair AI. Next slide, please, Emily. So as we all know, AI is very heavily embedded in the whole healthcare continuum. Now, if we start with the pharma, biotech, medtech space, there is no part of the drug development value chain where AI is not embedded. Starting from drug discovery, going into clinical development, and the allied aspects of manufacturing, logistics, IT, and then moving on to commercialization. All of these aspects and more have one or another way of AI embedded in it, guiding things, understanding the value chain, or predicting and making use of existing data to predict new things. So that's the life sciences space. If we move over to where drugs and services are used to provide care, the healthcare provider space, again, AI is used generally in two broad categories. One is operational, the other is clinical decisions. In the operational space, the examples of where AI is used can be as straightforward as bed availability or clinical materials management that lead to really efficient management and operational aspects of how healthcare systems are run. But on the clinical side, the examples are way too many. Just a straightforward example of how AI is used, especially in the chronic care space, is for chronic diseases like, say, chronic kidney disease or diabetes or heart disease, understanding progression of disease and then predicting outcomes. That's where AI plays a very big role. Obviously, in acute clinical decision making, like in the COVID landscape, there are many applications that are currently being used in terms of what type of treatment to provide and so on. Moving over to the payer side, which has always had aspects of advanced analytics and statistics always as part of the payer work, use of AI is a natural progression, and again, it's very much embedded in what the pair world does. So where does all of this lead us? All of this AI use points to certain major risk areas, and I've put 3 here in terms of bias, impact on privacy, and systemic effects on society, and there are many, many more. What this tells us is there is a need to assess trustworthiness of AI solutions. Next slide, please. So I wanted to, frame this from the perspective of, in order to be able to assess trustworthiness of AI, we need to have guidance. So guidance has come in a variety of ways from a variety of forums and organizations, both government organizations and people-centered organizations. Starting with 2017, the Asilomar Ai Principles, which basically was run by the Future of Life Institute, and they brought experts together for their beneficial AI conference. These experts included roboticists, physicists, economists, and they came up with 23 principles that were related to research strategies, data rights, and also superintelligence. So this was back in 2017. Again, in 2017, the Montreal Declaration for Responsible Development of AI. This was the result of a forum on the socially responsible development of AI. And the goal was to spark public debate and encourage a progressive and inclusive orientation to the development of AI. Progressing to 2018, AI for People. This was the first multi-stakeholder forum where the European Parliament, civil society organizations, and industry and media were involved, and they wanted to create a common public space for laying out the founding principles, policies, and practices on which to build a good AI society. Next slide, please. Right after the AI for People conference, the European Commission set up a high-level expert group on AI in 2018. And many of the scientific members of AI for People were involved in this expert group. I will go into a little more detail in the next slide, but for now, moving on to the very recent and in the US FDA AI/ML action plan that was released this year. This is really a build on a framework that was published in April 2019 discussion paper. And they offer a total product life cycle approach to AI regulation. For the really technical minded and specifics interested, there are 2 components. One is software as a medical device, pre-specifications, and the algorithm change protocol. They also encourage a harmonization of good machine learning practice, just like the other GXP components for pharmaceutical products, like good clinical practices, good manufacturing practices, and so on. Next slide, please. Looking at the European Commission's high-level expert group on AI guidelines, essentially what they came up with was that trustworthy AI consists of 3 components. One is related to laws and regulations, second to ethical principles and values, and the third is the promotion of technical and societal robustness. Taking the ethical piece of this, the ethical guidance is based on fundamental rights approach, and 4 principles are translated into specific requirements related to respect for human autonomy, prevention of harm, fairness, and explicability. Next slide, please. So then using this framework of guidelines that have existed and have been released by many organizations, how does one use the assessment process and operationalize it? This is what I think works generally. There are a certain group of foundational things that need to be done, and these are listed on the left. Having some sort of an expert group or a responsible AI board, which can discuss and come up with the resolution questions. Second is defining triggers. Are all AI solutions, do they need to go through this expert group, or does one do this by impact? Does this have high impact, low impact, and so on. So some sort of criteria that says when it should be used. And third is a workflow. So who are the owners of this process? Who are the stakeholders? These are the foundational parts of assessing trustworthiness. Then comes the main aspect of assessing impact, which is mapping against the requirements. For example, if you were to take the European Commission's high-level expert group guidelines, in this case, mapping against the 4 principles and seeing what is the impact, and then whatever findings are there, how is it addressed? That's the main work of assessment. And then documenting this process and then communicating with stakeholders, that is an important part of this process as well. So this is what I had in terms of framing this conversation for all of us to talk about. Thanks, Emily. That's the last slide that I had.
That's fantastic, Iksha. Thanks for that quick intro. And what I'd love to do is maybe have the rest of us comment on that. And if folks have questions, keep dropping them into the Q&A and chat as well. But you know, one thing that bothers me a little bit about how we talk about AI, not just in healthcare, but broadly, is we're going to have people jump up on whether it's a TED Talk or CNBC, et cetera, and talk about how much we need to fear AI, and someday AI is going to take over and make our lives miserable because the machines are going to start leading us. But that's decades down the problem. Our problem today is bias, unexplainability. Our problem is that the systems that we produce might not be fair, and we won't know it because AI is going to be hidden behind so many things that we have to be very cognizant of where they're hiding. So Muhammad, I'd love for you to comment on what Iksha talked about. How do we actually move beyond either the platitudes of loving AI or the crazy fear of AI and get down to brass tacks and say, how do I actually, what do I do? Well, who do I hire? What are the steps do I take to assess the trustworthiness of AI solutions? So Kensci is doing this today. What are you guys doing in the practical world of assessing trustworthiness of AI as you develop and deploy?
Thank you, Shahid. So first, a comment on trustworthiness in general. So it's not a new subject. Researchers have been discussing this for decades. So I did my PhD in 2011, and that was in computational trust. So this is an ever-present subject. With respect to some of the practical aspects that we are currently looking at, so there's I would say taking a socio-technical approach to many of these problems makes a lot of sense. And by that what I mean is that if you look at the technical aspects in machine learning, so like if you look at the machine learning pipeline, so first you start looking at the data. So does your data have historical bias? Does it has representational bias or measurement bias? And how do we get rid of that? And then from the data, then you come to the machine learning models. Then you assess things like, is there a learning bias? So for example, what are the things that your objective function trying to optimize? So for certain types of tasks, maybe something and it has been shown empirically as well as theoretically that for certain types of problems, simple models like, let's say, naive Bayes are less biased or are more fair as compared to, let's say, more sophisticated models. Let's say many of these deep learning models.
And pause there one second, Mohammed. You just said that the simpler it is, the more likely it is to be fair than if you go with the sophisticated, complex. Spend some time on that.
So it's a general statement. So it's not always going to be true, but for certain types of problems, that is going to be true. But that said, we can generalize with respect to simplicity, but then there's a trade-off involved with respect to how good the performance is going to be. So maybe you will get good, maybe you will have fairness defined, and there are multiple ways to define fairness, but let's say across multiple metrics of fairness, you'll have better models, but you will not necessarily have better predictive performance. So you'll have to balance for that. And then even if you have balanced models, biased models which are biased, then even after you have built these models, then there are different methods in which, let's say, doing post-processing, you can create more fair and balanced models. But those are, I would say, the technical aspects of that. The socio-technical aspects arise where where you have to look at the problem from a multiple stakeholder perspective. So let's say if you, from a data scientist perspective, your end goal is to, let's say, maximize performance. So you look at your standard machine learning metrics, let's say precision recall, AUC, and for fairness, let's say you're looking at a particular notion of group fairness. From a patient's perspective, so the patient may ask the question that, given that I belong to a vulnerable group, is this model likely to discriminate or against me? And the technical way to describe is that if it's a scoring model, then is it likely to give a low score for me, given that there's not enough representative data for me as compared to the dominant group? The physician or the clinician who's looking at the model, they may ask a different question with respect to, well, respect to casting the widest net possible with respect to, let's say, treating, having a model which can be used to treat which can be used to better risk stratify and treat the largest number of people. So the answer to that is, so to cut a long story short, so it's not going to be a simple answer. So you have to have all of these stakeholders involved and map all their concerns back to a more concrete technical manner, so that so that the discussion stays, so that you're able to, let's say, quote unquote, objectively have some criteria to define what is to be used for assessment.
Yeah, fantastic. And so we've got a couple of questions coming in already, and they're great questions. So I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to hand one off to Tom here. So the question from Zahid is, talking about AI, one of the issues is adoption into clinical practice. How do we solve this while physicians seem to be reluctant, which makes it difficult for technology to be adopted in practice in the first place? So Tom, what are some of the challenges in the adoption of responsible AI frameworks? And maybe if you want to kind of like loop in Zahid's question and maybe answer that as well, that'd be terrific. And of course, the other panelists can as well. Tom?
Yeah, first of all, it's a great question for whoever asked it, because we can do great things with AI unless it's put in the hands of physicians and clinicians, really coming in behind them to support what they do and make them better. It's really not going to drive much value. So I always start at the high level of, and it's a lot of what Iksha did a great job of framing around trustworthy AI and computing. Trust is the key factor to adoption. So for all we talk about digital transformation and AI, it will only drive change at scale if the users, consumers, physicians trust that what it's doing is not only producing benefit, but doing so in a way that fits up with their values and the way they practice or the way they want to consume healthcare as a consumer. Beyond that, as an advisor to a lot of big provider organizations, what we often see is the need for what I call the leadership imperative. Many times, and you can see it in the literature, including clinical literature, there are still articles written about how AI is eventually going to replace physicians and clinicians. And anytime I hear or read that, I chuckle, because to me, what that says about the author is they really don't understand the value proposition of artificial intelligence in health and medicine. It's all about not replacing physicians and knowledge workers, but rather augmenting the work they do, helping them have the tools to be better at something they care about. So when physicians are educated in a way that says, you know, what if, whatever specialty you're in, my ability to run you through an exercise is say, in that specialty, if there are 3 things you could predict that make you better, what would they be? When you start down that path and you start looking at how AI is empowering clinicians, to me, that's the key to adoption, and adoption at scale.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, Tom. And when you look at that adoption part, there's another question by Nardo, a friend out there and a colleague as well. How would an AI algorithm determine the right responsible decision in a multi-stakeholder scenario with differing contexts? Iksha, I'd love to bring you in, kind of like wrap this around the idea of standards. What is it that would make this a standard? Like today, what is our standard when we go about whether we trust someone? We see maybe social proof on a review website. We look to see where did that physician study. If he's from Dartmouth versus Harvard, that might indicate something. Where did he train under? Who are his physicians that he trained under, he or she trained under? There are lots of signals, social signals that we can use. what might be some of those social signals and standards one could adopt on the AI side?
Thanks for that, Shahid. Before I come to the standards question, I wanted to add a little bit to what Tom was saying around the question of, clinicians trusting AI to be able to help and so on. I think definitely agree with what Tom was saying. One of the other aspects of AI development is really bringing along clinicians in that journey. As you develop things, if they're developed, as they're brought in right from the beginning, there is the element of I understand what you're doing, what data is going in, and also understanding workflow. Where in that journey does the clinician need that augmented decision support or input or information? If that is all brought together, I think that would lead to much better uptake of AI. And it will eventually happen, but I think we could speed that up by making that experience of co-development almost. Coming to the
to riff on what Iksha is saying, absolutely. It's interesting to me how many times you see an AI initiative starting in a provider organization, and the physicians are kind of the last to be brought on. I mean, to Iksha's point, it's like it's a medical organization. It is less about technology, and everything Iksha you just said, it's all about improving that clinical and operational workflow. Who better than the people on the front lines?
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Coming to the standards question, I think standards, the role that they play, I think it's a very important role, especially when we are in the I don't know if I want to call it early days, but the evolutionary days of AI. Muhammad mentioned that talk about an understanding and study of responsible AI has been going on, and I agree, it's a long time, but we're really in the phase of AI development where a lot is happening and the space is very active. Hence, standards can really play a big role in helping people to meet certain things, and hence standardize the response to how to go about doing practical things. So in terms of standards development, the American National Standards Institute has come up with a set of recommendations and standards for assessing trustworthy AI. So I think that's a first step. It's a great step. That standards body is universally recognized, trusted, and used. So I think that's a very good step. But I also see other standards being brought in that will address different parts of the equation. Just like Muhammad was saying, we need all stakeholders in there. So I think standards will be developed that will address every part, and together all stakeholders, which will lead to much better ways of responding in a practical way to the assessment question.
So Iksha and Tom, do you suggest that maybe the American Medical Association, the American Hospital Association, they should be coordinating with ANSI? The one that Iksha just mentioned is ANSI. ANSI, of course, we use all day long in many, many different areas. But is it too early to really call these standards? I mean, because standards would indicate that something can be measured against, and you can see that, does something actually weigh 1.2 kilos? That is a standard of a kilo, and I can measure it. But without actual measurements, et cetera, how useful might standards be in this case, Tom? And then I'll pull in Muhammad to talk about that as well.
Well, it sounds like I'm going to go first, Iksha, but be ready for the handoff. So first of all, I wanted to call out, per your question, the American Medical Association a number of years ago was one of the first to come up with principles for what they call augmented intelligence. And so they actually wrote a very good document that defined a framework for clinicians to begin evaluating. I think to your point and to Iksha's earlier points, there are many groups developing standards or principles, including Microsoft. Anyone who wants to know our position, go out to any search engine, type in responsible AI, the Office of Responsible AI in Microsoft. It will take you to all of the work that our Office of Responsible AI is doing, not just to guide what we do, but hopefully to help create standards for others. Finally, there's a great report that Stanford's doing, which is a 100-year longitudinal study on AI. Part of this year's report has a whole chapter on this topic, where you have organizations with really good intent coming up with their own principles, But to your point, sooner or later as an industry, we have to merge those together so we're not, having Microsoft has its responsible AI principles and AMA has theirs. We have to move towards that standard body of how we operate.
Yeah, and I think, Tom, if you want to just add on, does it make sense for us to say, look, regardless of who you could be doing 80% of the work, whether it's the Microsoft or the technical groups, but we want this front-ended with AMA and others in specific specialties, or should it be the inverse, which is the technical teams are leading it and the AMA and others are providing input? Which would you prefer, even from the Microsoft perspective?
Iksha, do you want to take that one?
Sure, yeah. Honestly, I think it doesn't matter where this input comes in. I would almost advocate doing things in parallel. Let's do one where it's front-ended. Let's do one where the technical development starts, and reconcile these things. The more various different ways of addressing this, I think the better results we get. Yes, it can get chaotic, but if you have that mindset of doing things, failing, understanding, learning more, I think it doesn't matter. So I don't have a preference, but I think the more activity, the more development there is, the better it is for everyone.
Yeah, and what's fascinating about that word that you just used, failure, if we're innovating, we're failing all the time, right? So that's not a bad word to fear.
Exactly.
So let me bring in Muhammed here. It's interesting, we're talking about some part of this is flowery and fluffy, right? We should be doing the right thing. We must do the right thing. But how do you know you did the right thing, right? Do you have have you gone through over the last couple of years as you've been doing this, any examples of any setbacks, problems that popped out really quickly that you wouldn't been able to know in advance if you weren't looking for them?
Sure, yeah. So one example that comes to mind is where there's a mismatch between the objective function that you define in your machine learning model versus what you're trying to optimize for in healthcare. So this particular problem that I'm going to discuss is it's a prediction problem, which is known as left without being seen. There's a problem that you go to a clinic and you just have to wait for a long time. Let's say if the emergency department, you wait for 50 minutes and then you say, it's just not worth it. Let's say if you have a job, so you have to go back to your job and you just leave, or for some other reasons. Let's say you're a primary caregiver to another person and you just leave from the emergency department. So this model was deployed and it had what looked like sufficiently good precision and recall and AUC and whatever metrics that we use to determine performance. We even have anecdotal evidence that the model works. So for example, so there was this one discharge planner who said that when they were looking at the model, so it flagged one person and then that they are now at a high risk for leaving. So they went to that person and then she said, I'm glad that you asked me, you reassured me because I was actually planning to leave right now. So from that machine learning perspective, from the metrics perspective, the model works, but that's only half of the work. So after the prediction, what are you going to do? Once you get the results, then if you break down your results with respect to how the models are doing with respect to different, let's say, ethnic and social groups, socioeconomic groups, you realize that the patients who are disproportionately appearing are people who come from minority groups, and there's high correlation, at least for that. You're talking about a city in the Midwest, upper Midwest. So there's a high correlation between the socioeconomic status and ethnicity of a patient. So if you want to create responsible AI, and then it's not just about having a fair pipeline, having a model which treats everyone fairly, but you also have to look at the outcome. So the way that would address is that, so then you actually go back to the stakeholders, in this case, not just the physicians, but also the community workers. And then you see, well, why is it that a lot of these patients are leaving without being seen by a patient? Because if you take a longer view of healthcare, then that also means that fewer contacts with the healthcare system, which means that the long-term health is compromised. So once you have this model, you have identified these populations, then the next step is then you engage with the stakeholders. And so one of the solutions is that is that many of these people leave because they just don't have the time and resources. As I mentioned earlier, their primary caregiver cannot be away from home for a long time. They have jobs that they cannot get time off from. So instead of these people going to the clinic, maybe the clinic can go to these people. So maybe having mobile clinics, that could be one possible solution. That's what I'd like to call as an example of, at least on the surface, there's a mismatch between the machine learning objective function and the outcome. But if you look at it from a holistic perspective, then that's how you look at it from a more responsible eye.
Yeah, that's such a fantastic example. We've got a whole bunch of questions flying through. Let me ask one of these. I'll present it to you, Muhammad, first, and I'd love for Iksha and Tom to jump in as well. So the question from Ja Ning, I believe I pronounced that okay, is what do you think as the fundamental, most important reasons for AI trustworthiness in healthcare? Is it preliminarily due to the math behind AI, such as variance versus bias, optimization, objective function, or is it majority due to adaptation in the healthcare system, health disparities, education, workforce, interdisciplinary? And this is exactly what obviously, Muhammad, you just spoke about. Any way you want to kind of like tidy up what you were saying to answer that question specifically? And I'd love for Iksha to go next and then Tom.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So there are a lot of threads to I guess tie together. So first on the question regarding, so what are these important elements which lead to adoption or not a non-adoption? So it's next to impossible to just break these down into just a few things. There's also,
I want to talk to Jia's specific point, which is how much of this should you be worried about in the technical implementation versus the, I guess you would call it the clinical side, but for lack of a better word, would you have just some guidance to say, hey, spend 25% on technical and 75% on clinical, or opposite?
So I would say that we can keep these partially separate, and I say partial because so on the technical side of things, so I mean the clinician or any other end user for machine learning and AI, they don't need to know, let's say, the partial differential equations or how to assess these models. That said, my experience is that so having some minimal knowledge regarding how these models works actually helps. So for example, one point of contention for a lot of end users is just trying to understand the probabilistic nature of machine learning, because a lot of models that, let's say, clinicians and physicians are used to, they are very deterministic in nature. So if your model is saying that, let's say there's 0.8 probability that this patient has high risk of getting diabetes, then just trying to get that point across, what that actually means. And then on the other aspects of things, like, let's say if you're talking about fairness, then there's not one notion of fairness. So you can, even within groups, you can define different notions of fairness. Are we talking about fairness in terms of allocation, fairness in terms of individual fairness? Is it fairness with respect to outcomes? So having at least that technical understanding, again, you don't need to know the math, but at least understand what the problem is. Again, going back to the multi-stakeholder perspective, then you get your data scientists, your machine learning experts, and your clinicians, and even let's say your social workers together, and then determine which particular notion of fairness is applicable for this use case. And then after that, you can hand it back to your technical folks who can then try to optimize for that particular metric, however that is defined.
Makes sense. So Iksha, if you want to chime in based on what Muhammad was saying, that's great, but I'd like for you to expand a little bit more and say what you've seen with respect to success, and this is where Tom's going to jump in as well, and say, based on what guidance Muhammad was given, if you do X, Y, and Z, you're more likely to be successful. And there's another question that you could tie in kind of like with a nice tiny ribbon after that is, there's a question about moral, religious, and cultural aspects of being responsible around AI versus the clinical, the fairness, the equity, et cetera, part of it. One of the things that I kind of recommend to my colleagues, especially in computer science and others, is don't worry about the pieces that are so hard to do because we haven't even fixed the current problems of basic responsible AI for things we have great control over. Start with that and then jump into these more esoteric ones. Would you say that that's the case, or do you think that you could lump these religious, moral, cultural along with today's things about equity and bias, et cetera?
So on a practical level, I agree with you. I think the questions that are in front of us and the things that we think we can tackle as a group, as a community, and involving all of the stakeholders that we've been talking about, we should definitely tackle. Having said that, though, I think it doesn't hurt to start thinking about the tougher problems, because if we just push them down the line, there may come a time when things have become so complex that you're not able to go back and and you may have to re-engineer the whole experience of how things are developed and so on. So again, it's probably speaking from both sides of my mouth, but I would say for my here and now, I would say let's address the things that we can, but at the same time, keep an eye on what are the bigger questions, and even break down those bigger questions to see what we can address now and what we should put away for later. So that's my non-answer for you.
With that, Iksha, if you want to comment a little bit, is there the inverse of what Muhammad was saying? Is he's seen some failures occur like this? Any examples on the opposite side where we say if we do X, Y, Z, we're going to get to some success?
I truly believe in the power of bringing everybody along as you're developing things, and that's where I've seen success. In my prior life before I came to Microsoft, I was very much in the pharma biotech industry, and a lot of applications in that world are very siloed. Say clinical development wants to develop a way to design clinical trials that are more efficient, less drop off of patients, more engagement of patients, and so on. You can't do that as a clinical development. You need to work with the early discovery folks. You need to work with the clinical operations group, which will manage the trials and so on. So that, and then you need to work with the real world people who bring the data in from EMRs, claims, and so on. So it's so as you involve these groups together, you get to that place where everybody believes in it, everybody sees the value of what you're doing, and then it's a much more successful outcome.
Got it. And so, Tom, as I bring you in here, there's another really great question. So Dr. Wen, who's done work in AI for a number of years in healthcare, presents the following question. Related to what Iksha presented and Tom mentioned, there are many AI ethics thought leadership groups that have written standards, principles, best practices. But she goes on to say, seems like there's often a disconnect between the principles and the AI developers and also government leaders. So she's asking a really tough question, Tom, and I know you've written about this. So she's asking, how can these principles become more universally adopted by tech companies, maybe big corporations and AI startups like what Dr. Wen and Nardo and others are working on? Also, how to balance fairness with the tech companies' desire to control and steer people and a profit motive, because obviously there's a lot of that going on in industry as well. There are many groups that create principles, standards, ethical frameworks, but there seems to be a lot of disconnect in those. So what's your comment about the disconnect between reality and these principles?
Well, there were at least 10 questions in what you just said.
Yeah, I know, right? Wen asked really tough questions.
First of all, I start by building on what Iksha said. I'd say it a little differently, but the same. The answer to all of those questions is there's a leadership imperative in healthcare, whether it's clinical leadership, whether it's those driving the pharma and life science companies doing research, development, drug trials, whether it's those running these big not-for-profit health systems. It's all about understanding some of what we're talking about and putting it into play. What I'd try and do is bullet point some of answers to your multiple questions. One, we've talked about trustworthiness. It's important to recognize first that AI can be fully regulatory compliant, HIPAA here in the United States, GDPR in Europe, fully legal, and still highly unethical. So if something's compliant, legal, but unethical, is that something that's going to spur trustworthiness, whether you're a clinician or a consumer? A very quick example to illustrate. So everyone listening is now part of a new data science team. We've been asked we're working for a major medical association or a major medical center. We've been asked to be able to predict which patients who are inpatients are at likelihood of having an unexpected adverse event, which typically unexpectedly puts them in ICU. So we've developed an algorithm. We're risk rating all those patients, and our pilot has allowed us to predict with a fair amount of accuracy which patients are going to have an adverse event and get out ahead of it. So in our pilot, we've been able to prevent adverse events going to ICU by 40%. So quality-wise, it's a win. Cost-wise, if I'm keeping them out of ICU, that's probably a financial win. But 40% is a statistical average. If I told you that 40% reduction was skewed where we're 3 times more able to predict and prevent white males from having an adverse event versus Hispanic females, it's improving quality, it's lowering costs, it's regulatory compliant and legal, but we're 3 times more likely to produce good for white males versus Hispanic females. Is that okay? It's an ethical issue. It's one that different organizations might answer differently, but to me, it puts that point on the need to pay attention to all of this, the need to take much of what Iksha and Muhammad have talked about and really lock it into the approach to data governance any healthcare organization is taking. So there are many other things I could say, but it's a huge issue. And then finally, and maybe we can come back to this, even if we came up with the most precise standards, principles, it's still going to get down to health and medicine is not that precise. Ultimately, those things guide us, but it's that frontline physician and nurse that ultimately have to look at all of these things and come up with their own judgment on what to do that's best for a patient or a population of patients.
No, I love that. In fact, that example of being legal but not ethical sounds like a good dilemma. So Dr. Wen has clarified and narrowed her question a little bit more and asks, there are principles that say AI developers should do or check X, Y, and Z, but how do we get the AI development to adopt those principles in the software development lifecycle? Any guidance? And Tom, you're welcome to comment on this, and then we'll throw it over to Muhammad to say, how do you incorporate it?
Yeah, I mean, we've all said it. Everyone's early in the journey right now when it comes to AI in health and medicine. But, you know, the thing is, many times, again, leadership imperative, I'm going to keep driving that. I've been in situations before where I see a data science team very excited about an algorithm they're putting into the wild and into practice, and it's proven it's got high correlational value. But when you ask, and it will produce good in a pilot, but when you ask, have you stress tested for variance? The example I just gave, yes, producing good. Is there a variance between the demographics of you know, sex, income, race? And many times in the excitement to get that out there, people are not slowing down and stopping to say, well, we've tested it, but have we stress tested in a way that we're comfortable with the variance as we deploy it? Knowing that it's a continuous learning algorithm, that's going to change over time. But there are things like at Microsoft, we have something called Fair Learn, which is a way of looking at and evaluating things like that can be put into practice at scale.
Perfect. And Muhammad, any color commentary around how to train developers or maybe put things into the SDLC that might help with these aspects?
Yeah. So I will build upon what Tom just said. So one aspect of doing that is to have a very transparent process. So for example, one of the things that we do is that a lot of studies that we do, a lot of things that we have deployed, so we publish our work and findings in academic conferences and academic journals. So that just puts an extra layer where it can be, I mean, we cannot, of course, share the data because of privacy concerns, but at least the process can be vetted by a larger community of peers. The other thing is that, so we also, when it comes to fairness, then if there are certain tools that you're using to assess, then I strongly believe that should be open source. So like one of the libraries that we are using for assessing fairness, Fair ML Health. So we have open sourced it. That actually builds on Microsoft's Fair Learn that Tom mentioned. So just having a very open, transparent approach, I think that always helps.
Perfect.
I want to add to this, actually, Shahid. I think I agree with what Tom said, Mohammed said. Definitely, that's, you know, all parts of the process. I go back to that last slide that I had, which, you know, sets the operationally how you do things. I think one part of this is having the rules, the, you know, governing board that sets out the rules, the criteria. that's some upfront work. If you have your SDLC process that follows a certain guideline in terms of what they should do, how they should evaluate, and so on, it sets a certain level of expectation that everybody needs to follow when they're developing these things. And then the transparency, sharing, communicating, and what Tom talked about, all of those come into play. So it's really a combination of these things that can help to make these things operational.
That's perfect. And in fact, that brings up another question that Nardo asked. He says, it seems like we need new types of training, education curricula, and career trajectories to continue the work of responsible and trusted AI. He goes on to ask what kind of skills will be needed in order to become an expert in this space. And I'd love for each one of you to comment on that. Is how do you, I mean, it's so hard to hire right now as it is. And if you start to narrow and even look for more specific skills, you start to even lose the people that are being hired. But what are you looking for these days when you're hiring your AI staff to help out?
I can start. Yeah. So right now, honestly, the skill set is very focused on who can do the technical work of, the AI development that we need to do. But I think one very important question, especially because you mentioned, education, skill set development, and so on. I think the concept of and the study of bioethics, that's very important. And I think it should become a regular part of the curriculum of everybody going through, say, a computer science program or a medical program and so on. I think it already exists, but really beefing it up and making that so everybody, lay people, can then participate in how AI is coming into society and has an impact on everyone. So everybody has an opinion, can share this, and make things better.
Yeah, Tom.
So one, I think, fantastic question. It really is education across the board, not just the technical developers, to instill in them the sense of, not only technical proficiency, but looking at, again, things like, if I have the ability to do good, is there a way of having variance within an acceptable level? So it's doing good for all, not just some. The other thing is pulling back and having everyone, particularly clinical leaders, technical developers, anyone, really understanding what things like AI is really good at, and frankly, what, in my view, will never be good at. And in the world we operate in, particularly in health and medicine, it comes down to, with predictive capabilities, we're basically creating correlational values. And it's super important to understand this thing of correlation versus causation. So in my latest book, I have a facetious example where I use data and I can produce almost a perfect correlation between per capita cheese consumption and the number of people who died by falling down the stairs in the United States. So the question is, if we step away from the cheese plate, are we going to save lives? And the answer is probably not, but it's understanding what things AI does really well at. And then it's the art and science of medicine and how we bring that in behind the people and the processes to make things better.
Yeah, that's such a great example, Tom. If you would say, what do you think the appetite is at medical schools to be teaching in the same way that we teach biostatistics, in the same way we teach fundamental chemistry and biology? Iksha said, for example, that computer scientists should have ethics training. What kind of AI training should medical schools start to have, and what appetite do you believe, Tom, there is for us to start guiding med schools to have this at the fundamental level, if any?
Well, it's a great question, and some of that varies by medical school, but there are a number of medical schools where they're loading it into the curriculum. There are some medical schools that actually have divisions for digital transformation, and anytime you pop the hood on whatever someone's defining as digital transformation, you're going to find AI, and then you're going to find all the requisite issues that we've been talking about relative to all of that is driven by data. So we're seeing it happen. Let others pile on, but I think it's critical when it comes to the future skills of physicians and nurses going forward.
And Muhammad, would you be surprised if med schools called you up and said, "Hey, come and lecture to our students about ethics in AI, responsible AI," or would you welcome that?
Actually, I would not be surprised because I have done that in the past. And the other thing that I will add is that with respect to the computer science curriculum, is that, so my experience talking with my colleagues, people who are in academia, is that, so one deficiency that they see is that when we talk about ethics in computer science curriculum, then it's more often than not, it's an afterthought. So here's all of this technical stuff that we have talked about, and here's just one lecture about ethics. So having a more integrative approach to ethics, and also really drilling this, especially when we are talking about machine learning, that just drilling into the student's mind that you're not just creating models, it's not just about the objective function, but for many of these models, these are the things that will affect at the very minimum, the quality of life for another human being. I think that's very important. So like for the last few years, I've been teaching machine learning at UW, and I always have my the first lecture is always intro to machine learning. My second lecture is just always on just the ethical aspects of machine learning, so that early on it's drilled into the student's mind.
Got it. And Mohammed, just a quick question about the hiring part. So when you guys are doing your work at Kensci, are you hiring non-technical folks to come in and be on your team at this moment? Because there's another question that Dr. Wen asked about, how do you convince folks that are AI companies to go hire non-AI people to be part of their team?
Yeah, excellent question. So because we are a healthcare organization, so of course we have data scientists and machine learning experts. We also have clinicians and also nurse practitioners who are full-time staff members, because they bring a host of very rich domain knowledge. Just something as simple as just looking at the data. So me being, let's say, coming from a computer science background, I may just to give you an example. So I may look at a variable which is, let's say, abnormal blood pressure, and in my mind, and if it's coded in certain ways, I may not think about it, not even look at the values. But when I talk to a domain expert, in this case a nurse or a clinician, then one thing that I discovered is that it's encoded differently for the general population versus the pediatric versus the geriatric population. So me being a non-expert, I would not really have thought about that just by looking at the data, and that's something that comes natural. So I think, so that's why for all of the problems that we try to address, we always have a domain expert just to help us along that journey and to understand what the real purpose of the models are.
Great, perfect. And in the last couple of minutes that we have left, Tom, I'd love for you to take us home by talking about, where we're going over the next couple of years. What do you recommend that are the top things that, and let's talk specifically to the healthcare providers of the audience. What should they be doing about AI within their organizations at the moment, putting aside the technical aspects for a moment?
Right. Well, the first quick answer is lean in. It is the future. Everyone's early in the journey. It's becoming more and more pervasive. It will reach a point where, similar to, how many times have you ever thought about how your smartphone actually works? I mean, we get to a point where things become so commonplace and they just blend in. That's where AI is eventually going in health and medicine. The key to this is everything we've been talking about. It's some technology, but the real value is in improving clinical and operational workflow processes, all of which are very much human-centric, all of which require everyone to be mindful of not only what the technical capabilities are, but the social, ethical, and legal implications for how we apply it. And I just bring it down to, we all have a choice of AI is going to produce good for some of the population or all of the population. It kind of brings us back to how you framed it as you opened this session, where we all get to play a role in that. And a lot of that is understanding, making decisions in support of this being good for all.
Perfect. And we are now officially out of time. And I wanted to thank all of our participants, especially we got dozens of questions. So that was awesome getting all these questions. And we actually didn't get to handle most of our prepared questions. We had so many nice ones. So that was excellent. And of course, everybody, the recordings will be available. The slides will be available that Iksha presented at the beginning. And with that, please continue the conversation with us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and other social media. Tell us what we got right. Tell us what we got wrong. And where should we really be focusing, especially teams like Kensci that are out there doing the work. You know, Microsoft is a leader in almost everything that we do in digital anything. So the more input that we can provide, the better backup we can get from a tech behemoth like them anyway. So I'm sure they're looking for the input. And I want to thank Iksha for kicking us off with that great presentation, Tom and Muhammed for participating, and for the full HealthIMPACT and Microsoft team. I'd like to say thank you, and we'll see you next time on our HealthIMPACT episode.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you.